brownfield projects. And partnering is maybe one of the most exciting, fun parts of brownfields, believe it or not. And it's really get a way to meet people that ordinarily you may never meet or work with or associate with. But brownfield projects is kind of where the lion lays down with the lamb, and you should start finding yourself working with and partnering with people that otherwise you may not have. And let me explain who I am and the experiences I've had relative to that. Currently, my name is Mickey Hartnett, and I'm an environmental engineer by training. But in my former lifetime, I spent 25 years with US EPA, and I worked in hazardous waste and Superfund. And for 7 years, I managed the southeastern 8-state brownfield program for EPA. So I worked with communities all over the southeast, everything from little small rural communities of a couple hundred folks up to big urban areas, and also dealt with military base closures, which are a community in and of themselves, and it's like you're closing down and cleaning up the entire community in one big swoop, closing the whole town down and redeveloping it, which has created some unique issues. But in doing that over the years, I dealt with a lot of different folks, and folks that really I didn't know much about before I got into it, and got involved in a partnering process in brownfield projects. And it's really the horsepower that makes brownfields work, because there are grants, and there's money, which is always important. But one thing about brownfield projects is they are not Superfund projects. There's not this big pot of money and staff from federal agencies going to come down and do all this stuff. You have to do it. You have to find the money, bring the money to the project, provide the people and the energy to make these projects work. And that often means you have to start dealing with and breaking down some barriers in your community that may pre-exist, and a lot of times you don't realize they're there to start bumping into them on a large project, and even on very small projects. And that is that any community that's been around for a while, there's sort of opposing factions in the community, and that can be different parts of the community, but also there's all these little lines we draw. There's always somebody that gets referred to as those people. And anytime you got somebody that's those people, that's the people you need to invite in. That might be the best partner you ever had. And everybody's got somebody. I guarantee every one of you here is referred to somebody as those people. And that can be the people on the other side of the tracks. It can be engineers. It can be consultants. It can be industry. It can be the regulators. There's always somebody that you don't think they look at the world the same way you do. So it ends up causing some of these opposing factions in a community, but in reality that is more of a perception than the truth, because we have these little biases we grow up with and get kind of into a corner with, and you get these cultural divides going. We get to where we function in our own little box in the community, and you get these invisible walls built up. And what really becomes important the more you get involved in a brownfield project is you realize you've got to start enlarging that box. You can't stay in your little comfortable box. You have to, outside of that, start working in an area maybe you're not real comfortable in, with people that you haven't really worked with before. Whether it's a matter of their background, their profession, or whatever it is, that you think that they're just different than you couldn't work with them. And what it really is in order to really bring a project to life, you have to color it in. And what you got to do is make sure that everybody gets a crayon. Get one of those big boxes, and everybody gets a crayon out of the box to start coloring in the picture. Because really what it takes to develop a brownfield project is, an analogy to a quilt. Classic patchwork quilt, a bunch of little squares. Any of you here ever made a quilt? It took a long time, didn't it? But you did it one square at a time. You just keep sewing away, and all of a sudden one day, it's done. Voila. And when you get done, you have this thing that's beautiful and functional as an end product. Now, if you've got a whole bunch of people together, and you all start sewing on it together, you still have the same product, but it might come out better and get done a lot faster. And that's what partnerships are. It's you start bringing in more hands to the project. And Get this I see, it's got the little thing in there. And you know, if you make a quilt, the first task you've got is to gather the materials for that quilt. And a quilt is simply a bunch of little squares of fabric in your classic quilt that each of those little squares by itself isn't worth much. It's just, you know, it's too small, it's not good for anything else. But you start gathering these materials, getting a lot of squares, start sewing them and knitting them together, developing a vision of what that's going to become, and eventually it can become a thing of both beauty and function. And so, but that's where you have to know, well, what's your vision? Why are you putting these pieces together? Where's it going to lead to? So one of the important things is to develop a vision. And does your community have a vision of what you're going to do with this brownfield? Where's it eventually going to go? And that vision is something that, again, requires a lot of partnership, a lot of input, thoughts from different kinds of people coming from different perspectives to develop a vision. Again, this is where everybody gets a crayon to help color in this vision of what this is going to look like at the end. And so that's where it comes in the next question. Well, you have a vision, but whose vision is it? Is it just one person's vision, the community's vision, only one part of the community's vision, or the entire community? And actually there are companies that actually for a living they come in and do visioning exercises with communities. Because there's been a lot of places that seem they have brownfields and they knew they needed to get rid of the old mess. They needed to turn it into something better. But there wasn't a really consistent thought of what the new and better should be. And so they actually have gone through visioning exercises, and in doing that they literally use crayons. They get big white sheets of poster paper. They invite lots of people from the community in from these different perspectives. You know, people from City Hall, community groups, school kids. Kids have some of the best ideas sometimes. And literally use crayons to start drawing pictures of what should this look like someday. And out of that evolves a lot of concepts that can become that final thing of beauty and function. One community I worked with at one time is Chattanooga, Tennessee, and they had a brownfield being done on the river, kind of like here. And they did a visioning process, and they had one table, nothing but kids at it. The kids all agreed that they wanted a merry-go-round. The grown-ups all said, what do you expect out of kids? Kids want a merry-go-round. Well, guess what? They have a beautiful park down on the river now. It has a merry-go-round. And it is a focal point of their community redevelopment, is that merry-go-round. But the kids thought of it, the grown-ups didn't. So, I mean, you never know where the gems are going to come from and which partners are going to contribute the most. Or an idea that you just wouldn't have thought of because you don't see the world in the way they see it. Another example of how, you know, when I say partner, I'm talking about the verb. You know, this is making things happen with people. And one community I worked with one time, they had these little invisible walls. And this develops in a lot of communities. This particular community, it's a fairly small community, about 3,000 people, but the divides between the groups in the community were very deep. There was an economic divide, and there was a racial divide. And you do the math, and you really had about 4 distinct groups in town. You could not get those 4 groups to come to a public meeting all at the same time in the same place, because they didn't want to be in the same room together with each other. So how are you going to develop partnerships and a common community vision when they won't even be in the same room together? And what we did is we brought in a consulting firm who did things like this, and they went and met with each of the 4 basic divisions of the community separately. And with each group, they had them develop what they thought the problems were in the community related to the brownfields and in the community in general. What was their vision for the future of the community? What did they want to do to make the community better, make it survive? They asked the same basic questions of each group. At the end, they brought all 4 groups together. They kind of tricked them all. Brought them all together in one meeting, and they put up all these white poster boards on all 4 walls of what each group's vision was. And guess what? They were all identical. They all had the same vision. They all saw the same problems. And when they all walked around the room and saw that, then all of a sudden they realized, you know, those people might be okay. They have the same visions for this community that I do. And it really brought them together, and they formed a partnership. Doesn't mean they had to all of a sudden instantly like each other or sit around singing Kumbaya on a campfire or something. But they realized they had a common interest in the future of their community, and that was enough to bring them together as partners. So that's where you have to be open to reaching across some lines maybe you aren't used to reaching across. And when you gather the materials, and the most important material you can gather is people. Obviously there's other important things, money always being a big issue. There's other resources, organizational skills, meeting rooms. It's not super fun. Nobody's going to pay for the meeting room for you. You got to get your own meeting rooms. You know, that's a valuable asset. Doing flyers. There's nobody to pay for them. Got to be your own flyers. All those little things. But there's maybe people that could contribute that as a resource instead of having to pay for it, to have meetings, make things happen, inform the community, and to gather input from your partners. But you have to make an effort to really think about, now, who are these potential partners? Are there some of those people that you haven't talked to, they're not contributing? You need to reach out to them. And when it comes to funding sources, the more minds you get in a room, the more they start thinking, hey, I know where we can find money for that. And you start doing this patch quilt. The patch quilt starts coming together. All these little patches of fabric, these little patches of funding sources, resources, and ideas, and you start sewing them together, and all of a sudden, it starts to develop. And you remember the story of Humpty Dumpty and all the king's men, and I have to insist that it also includes the women and children in this day and age. So all the king's men is really everybody, men, women, and children. But there's a lot of sectors here. The public sector, federal, state, local, and tribal in the state. And it may be various government agencies, regulators, and things like that. Political, I don't care which side of the aisle they're on, but they're a way to find, identify, maybe obtain some resources. And they like to get credit for stuff, so if you can do something, let them take credit, they love that. I've done a lot of that myself. But private organizations and nonprofits, I mean, the company I work for is a nonprofit, but there's a lot of organizations out there that actually have funding sources, a lot of times for very specific things. They have their little interest. Like they're interested in fundings for soccer fields, or a golf course, or duck habitat, or wildflowers, or there's all kinds of little groups out there, but they may add another patch to the quilt because their interest will add a piece and help color it in. Mentioned earlier the historical societies and stuff. There's a lot of foundations out there that have funds. Now, they usually have funds for very specific things, but that may be something that'll fill in a piece in your project. The industry and business people, that's usually a lot of places, a whole group of those folks. Those folks can be extremely valuable assets. They have a lot of expertise. They got a lot of people working in their companies. They're engineers and scientists and other types of expertise that they can bring to a project, as well as obviously resources, and there may be ways for mutual benefit to work out with them. There's lots of community groups, whether it's the City Garden Club and other things, Lions Club, a lot of groups like that. There's a lot of human energy there that could be focused and help in a specific way. I know one developer one time bought a whole huge chunk of property across the tracks, literally, a bunch of old abandoned warehouses and all that. First thing he did was he went and found the garden club, brought them in, cleaned up all the weeds, and had the garden club plant flowers at all the intersections. And he said, well, why did he do that? He said, because when I bring investors over here to show them these properties, I want them to see a nice place with flowers, not a bunch of grown up weeds. So he gave a lot of resource to the garden club, and in return they planted the flowers. That helped the developer market the properties. And the garden club got all the resource out of it. And sometimes you can just make an organization. Maybe there's one that doesn't fit. You can create one. But you never know what's going to result. Remember I showed you the classic quilt, little squares. You may think when you first start out, well, we're going to make a quilt, we're going to sew these little squares together, it'll look like my grandmother's quilt. But as it evolves and you bring these resources in, it may look like any one of these things. And you think, well, that's not what I started out to make, but it has beauty and it has function. It just looks different than what you thought it was going to. Like the one on the far right there, they didn't have squares. They had long strips. But you sew them together, you still got a quilt. It still has beauty and function. So they worked with what they had. and you still came up with a quilt and the final product. So you got to keep an open mind on where you're going and what you're going to end up with. But the bottom line is partnering works if you let it work. And it's a very powerful tool in any brownfield project. And frankly, I've never seen a successful brownfield project that didn't have partnering. And it doesn't happen overnight. It evolves, it takes effort, and it takes being willing to sit down and talk and work with people that ordinarily you may not ever do that. And you'll be surprised. I've seen lifetime friendships evolve from people who never thought they would talk with those people. Talk to developers who never wanted to come meet, say, with a community group. Because as far as they were concerned, community people were the rabble with the pitchforks and torches that showed up at zoning hearings to fight anything they ever wanted to do. And they were scared to death to go to an open public meeting. But every developer I'd ever talked about that come to an open public meeting and just have open dialogue with them, they were enthralled after they did it. And every one of them said they ended up with a better project and made more money. And I also believe developers are not made. You can't go to school and learn when they're born. They're kind of a unique animal. They bring talent to a project you can't get any other way. So that's really kind of the message I want to deliver about, partnering. It's an active, dynamic process. You have to make an effort. You got to keep an open mind. You got to maintain some flexibility. And if you have a basic concept of where you're going to go, the more people you can get on board and get involved, the more the project gets colored in, the more crayons you hand out, and the richer the final product will be when you get done. Tell you a little secret about consultants. A lot of them are engineers, some of them are scientists, and they do the consulting for a living. That's their job. Provide technical advice, send you a bill. A lot of consultants like to get involved as partners on the front end of the process, and down the line they may help them to bid on projects and make some money out of the project. One little secret about engineers, I'm one myself, they can't keep their mouth shut. They can give you more free good technical advice than you could ever get by paying for it. And that's true of a lot of folks. If you get them on board and make them clear that you want to hear what they got to say, then the valuable information starts pouring out. But you also got to be willing to listen and hear what you're hearing. So if somebody says, maybe we need a merry-go-round, and your first reaction is, well, that's a silly, stupid idea, maybe you need to give it a second thought and say, well, maybe it's not such a stupid idea. Maybe it's not going to be a quilt with squares. It's going to have circles or strips or something, but it's still going to be a quilt, and we're going to get there. So that's the message I wanted to deliver. And with that, I'd like to turn over to the other two gentlemen who can bring a perspective of bringing a different kind of viewpoint to a partnership. And I think, Evan, I was going to ask you to go first, or John. Let John go first? Okay, John Rogers from EDA. And I don't know their bio, so they'll explain to yourself who they are. They're used to doing that.
Well, thank you. I thought Evan was going to go first, or next. That's okay. Evan, I got to tell you though, after that last panel, I hope you have rehearsed a song and dance, because otherwise this thing is going to die. They were great. They were terrific. They talked about the Milltown Dam. Evan was waylaid by a traffic accident west of here, so that's why he just rolled in. He wasn't involved in the accident, but the traffic kept him from getting here on time. But I get the feeling today that a two-day conference was squeezed into one day. At least for me, I've soaked up about as much as I can, and we have the misfortune of being the last panel of the day. So hopefully, we can keep it interesting. I have to tell you that this slideshow is really a canned one from our headquarters in Washington, and I've modified it a little bit, and as you go through, you'll notice there's some pictures in here. And I replaced the pictures that they had because they were buildings that I didn't recognize and things, and I didn't have a lot of buildings that you would recognize, so I just threw in a bunch of pictures. So if you're wondering why those pictures have no relevance to the slide, that's why.
Is it your family vacation, John?
No, they're not that bad, but In fact, I wish I had thought of that. My name is John Rogers, and I'm with the Economic Development Administration. And one of the EPA folks from Helena said they're from a small office in Helena. I don't know, they've got 18 to 30 people or something. Well, they don't know what a small office is. I'm the only person for EDA, and I cover 3 states, so that's a small office. Basically, EDA provides grant-based investments. In other words, we make grants. We don't do loans, we only do grants. And we target our grants to, you got to remember, the name of the agency is Economic Development Administration. So economic development, we always say try to use those 2 words somewhere in your proposal. Higher skill, higher wage jobs. And some of that other stuff is just gobbledygook that I'm not going to go through. We have Brownfields for us is not a program. Brownfields for us is an initiative. What I mean by that is EPA and HUD have separate programs for brownfields. We don't. Our program is, we use the same toolbox that we normally have. We don't have a set-aside amount of money for brownfields. So basically what it is it's one of the initiatives that we pay attention to. So all things being equal, if your project is a brownfields and one is not a brownfields, the brownfields one's going to score a little bit better and has a better chance to get funded. There are a number of national initiatives. This is the one of them. I think this is the one that is most important to us and that we are most involved in, day out. And in fact, I think EPA will tell you that EDA is the biggest partner, federal partner, that they have in the brownfields program. There is actually, if you think about it, there's a reason for that. It's very simple. And that is that we're an economic development agency, and if you think about it, most of the brownfield sites occurred in former commercial or industrial areas. Very few brownfield sites happen in a former residential area, although it's possible. So when you redevelop a commercial or an industrial area, quite often it becomes redeveloped as another commercial or industrial area, not all the time. But if it is redeveloped as, for example, a residential area, that's not our bailiwick. There's another agency called Housing and Urban Development, or in the case of rural areas, USDA Rural Development has a lot of housing programs. The first program up there is called Public Works Program, and it's basically what it sounds like. It's roads, bridges, buildings, brick and mortar. It's a construction program primarily for public infrastructure. The second one is economic adjustment. Somebody talked about redevelopment of closed bases, closed mills in this part of the world. Any time that you've lost a lot of jobs in a short period of time, the economic adjustment program is there. It's also being used today in large part for the floods in Iowa and in the Midwest. Recovery there. Research and national technical assistance, ignore that one. That's a program, but it's a pittance and you have to go to Washington to get it. Local technical assistance and partnership planning are 2 programs that are almost indistinguishable in certain ways, and those are really important programs from our viewpoint for the Brownfields program, in addition to the first 2, the Public Works and Economic Adjustment program. That's the Public Works program. It kind of tells you what I just said about upgrading public infrastructure and economic adjustment. Under that, we can also do revolving loan funds. And there was some talk this morning about EPA's RLF program. We have a standard revolving loan fund program, and there is no reason why you can't use that program for redeveloping brownfields areas. In other words, you can do it. There's nothing that would prohibit you from doing that. There are a number of them in the state. The one locally here is the Missoula Area Economic Development Corporation has an EDA-funded revolving loan fund. There are a number of them around the state. You'd have to ask me who they are that has them. Beartooth RC&D has one, for example, in your area. Let's see, the Local Technical Assistance Program is basically kind of a small grant program to do some planning, to do some feasibility studies, those kinds of things. Quite often, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our planning program and roll that in there too, because we have what we call a short-term planning grant or a one-time planning grant. And they're almost indistinguishable between local technical assistance. They're two different pots of money. You let us worry about which pot of money it comes out of. But basically, one of the issues or one of the problems with brownfields is you have kind of a two-step process. One is the kind of the assessment process and the cleanup process. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. But the other end of that is the redevelopment process, the planning for redevelopment. And these are some of the tools where you can use it for the planning for redevelopment. We will not do assessments. We will not do cleanup. That's not EDA's mission. But we can look at how are you going to redevelop that site, particularly if you're going to redevelop it as a job generator. If it's primarily going to be residential, again, that's not our bailiwick. So although there are some projects where we've done mixed use and we're free to sort of buy into the idea that we can do something beyond that. Partnership planning, I talk about the short-term planning grants. We also, though, fund economic development districts across the state. And we have one right in this area. In fact, we're almost wall-to-wall in the state. Marcy Allen with Bitterroot Economic Development District. If you want to access our programs and you're from this three-county area, get a hold of Marcy because she's done these things before. She's done the proposals to us. You don't have to gear up. You don't have to figure out what are the EDA rules. She knows them, or if she doesn't, she calls me. I'm going to skip trade adjustment because it has very little impact on this program. These are just our guidelines, but basically, I think it's kind of amazing. You have criteria, but all of your customers, the first thing they want to do is ignore the criteria. And I got to tell you, you can't ignore the criteria because Brownfields isn't a separate program for us. It has to have all of our bells and whistles or it's not an EDA project, period. If it has the bells and whistles and it's got another bell called Bbrownsfield, that's great, we love it. When it talks about processes regionally driven, I think a lot of times, sometimes in brownfields, the lesson here for me is that people have a tendency to focus on a site. Because in the assessment process, you kind of define the site. You say, okay, this old mill was right here, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to assess this site. But what we forget about is that that site impacts a much larger area than just the boundaries of that site. And when we talk about partners, that's why partnerships are important, because you've got adjacent landowners, nearby neighborhoods, you might have another public facility, you might have a whole street system that is impacted by that site. And so I guess the lesson there is that you need to look well beyond the site in considering everything that is done. This is really EDA's portion of the project. You see that little circle there, the assessment and the cleanup and the reuse. We are reuse. We do not do those other two functions. And occasionally we can do our part, a part of our part, at the same time that those other two are going on, particularly cleanup. If you've done the assessment, you've got an idea of what you're going to do with the site, you don't have to sort of wait till all that process is done and then say, okay, now we're going to go to EDA. Because, if you did that, we were looking at a project today, you'd be looking at the year 2020 by the time you came to us. So actually, we can multitask too. We understand that quite often when you're going through the assessment process, you probably want to talk about what are we going to redo with this site. In the real world, people don't get excited about the assessment and the cleanup process. What they're really excited about is what the end use is going to be. So in order to get people to commit to an assessment process and a cleanup process, a lot of times they're not going to commit till they have some idea what the reuse is going to be. Otherwise, why bother? In their mind, why bother? It's the slide this morning that the gentleman had about, we don't want a site that just has a fence around it and it's a vacant site, but it's cleaned up. We want something on that site. Same thing with the community. We're not going to, most communities aren't going to get excited about cleaning up a site without understanding or getting a feeling for what the redevelopment is going to be. So that's where, for example, our planning program and our technical assistance program can be involved. This talks a little bit about what I just said about brownfields inventories, redevelopment plans, the planning end of things. We can also be involved in the public works program in bricks and mortar. For example, you've reconfigured a site and now you need water and sewer and you're going to do some street work, that kind of stuff. That would be typically what we'd be involved in. We can only in a marginal way be involved in cleanup, and it's only if it's incidental to the project itself. And a good example would be, let's say you have an old hospital you're going to redevelop for some purpose, and it's full of asbestos. Well, asbestos abatement, we do it all the time. It's generally incidental to the redevelopment of the building. We wouldn't insist that you somehow clean out or clean up the asbestos before we get involved. So sometimes when it's incidental, we can be involved. This is just from quite a few years ago, but it's $223 million in over 200 brownfield investments. $6 billion in private investment. That's what drives our program. If it's private investment, 100,000 new jobs. So we have a considerable amount of experience. This slide is really, it's for FY01 through 06 investments, but it's really wrong that for Montana we actually have quite a few more investments. I'm going to talk very quickly about what we're doing. This slide, by the way, is wrong. As of yesterday, there's a new national coordinator. And you'd want to ignore it anyway. You'd want to call me anyway instead of him. We have, right now, we have a project. We just made a grant to Big Sky Economic Development Authority. They are doing a redevelopment plan for what is essentially the east side of downtown proper. It's a transitional area. We use the classic brownfields definition. It has a lot of underutilized areas. It has some suspected contamination, although we don't know whether there is any or not. We've made a grant to them for $100,000. They're in a separate process, are doing some other work in terms of assessment. We are involved in the redevelopment plan. So they're going to use the money to hire consultants to help them do the visioning process of what this area is going to look like. Probably the best example of an EDA brownfields project in the state is not technically a brownfields project. It's in Helena, and if you're familiar with Helena at all, the Great Northern Town Center is adjacent to the old downtown proper, and because of its historic nature, the old downtown couldn't grow because they're all historic buildings. You can't tear them down and put up new buildings. And so there was an infill issue. There was a potential old rail yard. It was called the Great Northern Rail Yard. And when Burlington Northern actually, the Northern Pacific and Great Northern went together, it became redundant in terms of a rail yard. They didn't use it anymore. So it went to seed, and you cannot believe how bad it was. And the downtown folks came to me and said, hey, we need some money to do some visioning process. They came to us. I'm embarrassed. It was only $25,000. We had a limit of $25,000 at the time on our technical assistance grants. They then convinced the city commission that we had committed $25,000, which we hadn't yet, and leveraged $75,000 for the study, and they put in $100,000 for the study. And there were 17 landowners in this property, and I got to tell you, it was Skid Row. And today, this was done in the early 90s. It was just before Brownfields was really announced as an initiative. And today there's $75 million plus private investment in that little area. And it has started to spill out around it, around the area. And this is what I mean about taking into consideration the other areas. DOT came in and replaced the bridge. It was a bridge over what had been a railway line that went underneath it. Instead, they replaced it with a pedestrian-friendly bridge that allows a tunnel over to Carroll College. Before this time, Carroll College really students had no way of getting downtown. I mean, they had to cross this busy street. It's not at all pedestrian-friendly. They have, the multiplex theaters, commercial. There's a new condo just off-site, is being redeveloped, an old brewery into a condo. Office buildings, you mentioned there's a carousel right in that area. It's mixed use, it's a great place to go have dinner, it's a great place to recreate. It is the quintessential sort of example in Montana. So if you ever get to Helena, it's good to go down there and I do have a lot of before and after pictures as well. It did receive, was one of three finalists last year for EDA's National Excellence in Economic Development Awards. And it is quite, and it is still going. They've announced a new building. They just turned dirt for a new building in addition to the ones that they have. So Evan?
Are you taking questions now, or
You demand.
Would you like to do a presentation first?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll keep this up as my slide. My name's Evan Barrett. I'm the Chief Business Development Officer for the state of Montana in the Governor's Office of Economic Development. I've been doing that since Governor Schweitzer was elected, which is almost 4 years ago now. Prior to that, I worked 18 years as local development director for Butte Local Development Corporation in Butte, which is the home of the nation's largest Superfund site and therefore smallest brownfield opportunity. And that's an important issue. In fact, you look in places like Montana where the damage is often large, you've got huge boundaries which a Superfund site has around it, and not everything inside that boundary is necessarily so bad that it couldn't be a brownfield site, but the truth is it can't be. We certainly fought for years to isolate certain parcels and say, let's rule this parcel can be brownfields, so we can do something with it while the larger cleanup is taking place under CERCLA, and tried every possible trick in the book to try to get that to happen, and still we're not successful. So that's one of the challenges that exists. That brownfields is a good concept, but again, in a state like Montana, if you have areas that are very huge that are identified as bad areas, if they become Superfund sites, it kind of shoots you down. I mean, it's a good reason for that. I mean, if you can do remediation with money that comes out of the pocket of the polluter, and that's really what Superfund is about. You know, there really isn't much money in a Superfund anymore. The Superfund doesn't have money. Superfund was built out of tax on chemical companies, and they stopped collecting that money about 5 or 6 years ago. And so now it's catch as catch can, if you will, a little general fund here and there. But obviously they're looking for the PRPs, the potentially responsible parties, that have pockets that are deep. So if you take, I'm doing a little bit of Superfund here, but you take from Butte all the way down here to Milltown Dam, and it is the largest Superfund site in the nation, and currently BP, formerly British Petroleum, formerly ARCO, prior to that the Anaconda Company, have deep pockets, and they will have spent, and by the time this is all settled on out, over $1 billion will be spent between Butte and here cleaning up. So when you have that kind of money laying around, it's understandable that a small program like Brownfield says, well, get your money out of ARCO's pocket. You don't need to get it out of our limited pot of money, and that's understandable. But one of the challenges that exist, both in terms of Superfund and then in terms of Brownfield, is, okay, so what do you do? Superfund is about making a place safe for human beings, not necessarily developing it. A lot of places in this nation, institutional control, as it is called, means you put a fence around it, you put a stop sign there that says do not enter, and you isolate the danger from human beings, and you have an ugly, undeveloped site that might be in a primo location, and you don't do anything with it. So part of the challenge under Superfund, and then this is where Brownfields is, is a better way to do it actually in some senses, is to try to take, and when you're cleaning it up, you're developing it too. All you have to do is drive by Anaconda, and take that road into Anaconda, and you see these, as far as you can see, this land that is extraordinarily difficult to develop. And it's been part of a Superfund site. The development of something that big goes way beyond the capacity of Brownfields to do it. But that being said, Brownfield still is a tool. And so even though many of the areas in this state, and luckily Brownfields has been expanded to include mining areas, for example. Originally it didn't include mining areas. Well, this is a state, oro y plata, right? Our motto is a state, gold and silver. We were built on mining. Hundreds, thousands of old mine sites. There are other federal laws that can be used to help clean up mine sites, but brownfields can be part of that mixture. Often the mine sites are isolated and there's no real economic value. You just, what do you do with it? It's up in the hills, and why would you drive 15 miles to be somewhere like that? And what does it give you? But so much of what we have is borders, traffic patterns, and communities, and the trick, ultimately, so we don't have institutional controls, which are a bunch of fences, is to develop to use brownfields and other monies, and it's all about partnering. I think the message about partnering is very important here. To use those other monies and brownfields money to actually turn it into something. So, the talk about visioning, very, very important. What's your vision for what you want to do with it as a community? I found that you can argue forever over things that are theoretical, because you're looking for utopia. And so people will argue and fight about what ought to be there, but and you can talk about it forever. Well, I think it ought to be this, and I think it ought to be that. Actually you can create something if you have something specific. I mean, I'm bricks and mortar. I'm put infrastructure in, build a building, put a business in, have some people working there. If you can combine, at least as a target to begin with, a real project with a site, the resistance, first the inevitable, we'll take 5 years to think about this, kind of goes away. There are people who just love to take 5 years to think about it. And so if you can tie it into a real project, that's good, because it'll move it faster. Now, by the way, if the project disappears later, who cares? You got this stuff done. And another project comes. But a prospective project will help drive a project better than just the concept. There are people that, like I say, they make a living by doing concepts, and jobs, business, generally business, with jobs attached to it is the product you want to have. At least I'm an economic developer. That's what we want to have, is something that is usable. Now, some brownfields areas, there's a difference, and that is, well, what if it ought to be a park? You got a whole different pot of activity. If your vision is that this ought to be a green area, and it ought to be something that the people can have as a green area. Then, you know, you got a different kind of pot of money that you go after than you do if you're doing the economic development. I can't speak much to that. I'm from Butte. We do believe in green, but
It's a
we
different.
don't have as much of it. But it's a different kind of green, we believe, with the dollar bills. But if you want to do business development, you know, get your vision. But if you can have a project, you can get your city fathers and mothers to act quicker. You can get the visioning to go better. And ultimately, if it dies and goes away, you've got your project done. If you've done things like put the infrastructure in, cleaned up the mess that was there and got the infrastructure in. In terms of partnering, and again, let me just say that in Montana, we have a lot of this problem because of the nature of our old economy. We were an extractive economy in Montana. And when you were mining and when you were doing forest work and, you know, the old way of doing it was usually wouldn't pass muster today. We're talking about East Helena. I mean, you go to pole plants, and what did they use to treat the poles? You couldn't use it today. And now getting that stuff cleaned up is difficult. So the old economy created a lot of this problem for us, which makes us kind of unique in the sense of the opportunities that are here. But partnering, again, my recommendation almost always for folks is have something economic come out of it. So that involves money, first clean up and infrastructure, and then facilities and jobs. And so there's a series of different kinds of money. And so first and foremost, we think you have to tie into the CRDCs, Certified Regional Development Corporations, that exist in Montana, and where they have a strong LDO, local development organization, within a CRDC. You work with an LDO, but if you work with the local development organizations or the Certified Regional Development Corporations, they're going to be able to guide the ship, if you will, and they know where to go find the money. You know, the state's got a lot of programs, and the leveraging of the state programs against the federal programs and the local programs, the local money is, I mean, it's all about that kind of green. So obviously, tax increment districts are a very, very good vehicle for local money. There's not a lot of good vehicles for local money. Tax increment districts are. I know the Department of Revenue doesn't like me saying that all the time, but it is one of our better tools for aggregating capital at the local level. And there's flexibility in using it. So if you actually have, remember, if you actually have some increment, that's always the challenge of a district. One of the things you can do is feasibility studies are a legitimate expenditure under tax increment districts. Feasibility money is doable under the Big Sky Economic Development Trust, which has been now about 4 years in existence. So that was a new thing. We didn't have a vehicle much for feasibility analysis at the state level. But to get state money, local money, federal money, and do your analysis and your plan, that can happen. Now, when we turn to infrastructure, again, we're going to round up the usual suspects in our game. You know, you can use 8 or 10 state programs on infrastructure. The Board of Investments infrastructure program has to be tied to a specific company. And it's all about public infrastructure that can support business development. So whether it's CDBG infrastructure through the Department of Commerce, which is HUD money, but it loses its identity, it's state money. Whether it's Board of Investments infrastructure money, which is a de facto grant. It's paid for by the company, but they get an offsetting state tax credit. The TSEP, if you could be patient enough to want to wait. You know, some of these programs aren't very timely, but these are places where you can go find infrastructure money and combine it with the best source. Again, it has to be tied, as John is talking about, for EDA to have money in it. It isn't about making the place nice, and it isn't about doing a park, but if it has jobs, then first place you go is to John and make him work hard. You know, you know, so there are places to go for this infrastructure money. This is part of that partnership. But again, some of you are the practitioners. I'm preaching to the choir. You're practitioners. You already know this stuff. But if you don't know it, then get to know your local development organization or your CRDC, and just work with them through all this kind of stuff, because the state of Montana will make things happen when everyone's working together. Local government is part of it, but the local development corporations, the private nonprofits that actually drive economic development, are the key to making it happen in our estimation. I also think that I would strongly recommend this, that if you're economic developers, you're probably already members of MEDA, and if you're not, if you're planners, I would recommend you join MEDA anyway. Because right now, what happens at this thing, you're learning some stuff here, mostly from other people, not from me, but you're learning stuff here. But what's important is when you're out in the hallway talking to each other. The networking that occurs is where you learn how to do this kind of stuff. And I was not a believer in that. When we first were trying to get economic developers together, I thought, well, this is a waste of time. They go off, and, you know, but I found very quickly that you can really learn the stuff. And if you want to work with local development organizations for a modest amount, I don't know what it is now, I don't know if it's $50 or $100 or something, I don't know, but join MEDA. Twice a year meetings. They advance a legislative agenda that benefits everybody. There are several hundred people in it. When the meetings occur, like next Monday and Tuesday in Billings, the breakout sessions are all good, and the hallway time is invaluable, invaluable. Every time I go to one of those meetings, I come away, in spite of spending 20-some years doing this, I come away learning something. So I would strongly recommend the planners that want to do brownfield type activity, since ultimately it'll connect to economic growth at some point. For it to mostly it'll happen that way. You need to know how the economic development stuff works. Now, again, there's infrastructure stuff. Then there's the prospective business thing, and the partnerships are just as strong there. You've got to have local banks involved, and it gets tougher to get them involved because it's a nasty place. You know, maybe I've got a liability issue. Now, there have been laws passed that limit liability for financial institutions, but it doesn't matter. They get nervous about it. That's where revolving loan funds come in. We actually have in Montana 3 revolving loan funds for a total of $2 million. We have $1 million in 2 funds in Great Falls. I think they may have been tied to the military aspect, military dislocation. They have 2 funds. And then the $1 million fund here in Missoula. So you got a $600,000 fund and a $400,000 fund, and then you got $1 million in Great Falls and $1 million fund here. That's good stuff to do. So I think too often folks forget to take that extra step. If you should look upon a brownfields opportunity site as an opportunity to go steal some money from the feds. You know, I mean, I'm serious about that. You know, the money drives all these deals. Your ability to put money on the table. You make stuff happen by putting money on the table. So RLFs are important. I think John and I know we have a good story about an RLF, don't we? We got an RLF one time. It wasn't green brownfields, but we got an RLF one time, and they wanted it back because the deal kind of started to crater. And we said, sue us. And after about 3 years of working our way through it, we kept $3 million. I can't tell you how many jobs were created by having that money. You got to have green to make stuff happen. So try to do RLF activity if you can with this type of thing. And you got to match that with other monies, and you'll get probably on a brownfield site less private sector money and more public, just because of the fear factor of the liability issue that scares banks. So, you know, move in that direction if you can. And again, that's again where you're tying with local development people. they're the people that know and have revolving loan funds. Another thing, if you want a revolving loan fund, you got to have somebody have it who can run one. They won't give a revolving loan fund to somebody who doesn't know how to run a revolving loan fund. So that's why if you can get it plugged into a CRDC or an LDO that has revolving loan money, they can manage it. It'll work out fine. So there's a lot of partners in this type of thing, but ultimately, with the economic development perspective that I certainly bring to the table and our office does, is vision, but vision with a purpose. And if you can vision with a specific project, it'll move it faster. Find infrastructure money from myriad of sources, including brownfield sources, and then, of course, get some real capital to put somebody into locate a building, if it's a clean spot, or if you're retrofitting an area, if you're fixing up an area where there's old buildings, and you fix the building up, whatever it is, something that can house jobs and growth. Jobs and growth drive federal money substantially. You can sell almost anything if you've got jobs with it. And if you've got, the cleanup is nice, the jobs really make it work. So that's again where that partnership makes some sense. So we could go into more detail about what we have here, but let me also mention very importantly, and then I'll be done, which is local governments are a big part of this, but very importantly from the perspective of my boss, and we're happy to see this happening, the number of reservations that have Brownfield's money now. Because there's no places that are more economically depressed than the reservations in Montana. The economics that the unemployment level is bad, the income levels are horrible. It's not easy to create economic growth on reservations. If it was easy, it'd be done, because everybody is conceptually for it. So we're pleased to see that the federal government in its brownfield allocations is doing well by the Indian reservations in Montana. And they're now starting to do planning, and a lot of the planning activities, the competitive assessment activities are happening on reservations as well as happening, with CRDCs and the like. So if you're in a reservation area, again, the ultimate tie-in there is going to be the tribe. And so that's worth doing as well. So my time is up, so I think what we'll do is open this to back to questions or something.
Yeah, if anybody would like to have questions, and we just had two quick thoughts, because to reinforce some things you heard. You might be led to believe that it's assess, clean up, and then redevelop. And physically, when it comes to moving dirt, that's true. But when it comes to visioning the redevelopment and determining what you're going to do, you do that as early as possible, because that vision then drives the cleanup, brings in the partners, brings in the grants, the private investments, and everything else. Because before, and as you kind of heard mentioned a couple of times, before people want to put money in, they want to know what you're going to do with it. And how can you tell them what you're going to do with it if you haven't got at least a concept already? But having said that, sometimes you have to leave the concept morph a little bit. And just a quick story I'd tell you once, because it just seems very typical. And that is, it was a kind of a low-income community. A large part of it was a brownfield area. Running right through the middle of it was a stream that had been re-engineered by the Corps of Engineers for flood control reasons. They had flooding problems. Well, they started developing their vision. One of the things they had in the vision was a hiking and jogging trail alongside the stream that the community members could use. So they went to the Corps of Engineers and thought, well, they'd be a good partner for that. They knocked on the Corps of Engineers' door and sat down with them and said, we'd like to know if you would build us a hiking and jogging trail alongside that stream you just rebuilt. And the Corps of Engineers said, oh, we don't have money for hiking and jogging trails. Can't do that. No, just sorry, but we don't have money for that. So they were about to get up and leave the office, and the guy from the Corps said, of course, it's too bad you didn't ask me about doing a maintenance road. We can pay for maintenance roads. And I thought about that, and literally went out in the hall, rearranged their tie, came back in and said, excuse us, we'd like to talk to you about a maintenance road alongside that creek. And he said, fine, I can pay for that. By the way, people can walk on it. It's okay. So you got to be quick on your feet and roll with it. So that kind of goes with some of the things you heard. But any questions you'd like to ask myself or the gentleman here? Yes.
This question is for Evan. Evan, you know, we've seen a great, I mean, this conference has been incredible, the amount of people that have shown up and the interest and the great topics. So obviously we're seeing a real increase in brownfields money coming into the state and people trying to establish programs. How do you see this component tying into the restoration economy at a state level?
Well, thanks. She asked about how this ties into the restoration economy. And yeah, it's a big part of it. I mean, you know, you've got the restoration economy is what I know we've been promoting and the governor's been promoting, which is creating jobs and growth out of fixing up what's been messed up in the past, essentially. And and whether it be Superfund money or whether it be negotiated settlements or whether it be Brownfield or whether it be just a state Superfund activity, there's a lot of ways to do it, and it is rather significant when you start adding up all the jobs and all the resources that are there. So if it helps, first of all, any kind of brownfield activity actually just augments the whole idea, you know, but the flip side of it is, don't hesitate to work with us at the state level, because if you can brand your project as part of, if you get a little sizzle, you know, out of the name of restoration economy. It's the same work that was being done, except we're packaging it and trying to recognize it. So if it may actually help to have a project identified as part of that. It also helps us to show the documentation of the value of it. So, yeah, it's an important thing, and we think it's an important way for the state to turn the corner from the past, the problems of the past, to, you know, because people don't think about Montana being kind of messy, but based on our old extraction economy, we are kind of messy. But that cleaning up is part of what leads to that quality of life and the recognition that one of the things that makes Montana grow right now is people believe this is a place where you can have a good quality of life. And restoration economy is a way to also say that. So, but if it helps put a little sizzle with the steak, yeah, just join in.
Do you see any assistance coming from the newly formed restoration, I don't know what the office is called?
Well, to put it this way, there is no special pot of state money for it. But that being said, it was like John was saying, if you take a regular project that would pass muster with EDA and you add brownfields to it, it gives it a little extra points. There is some discretion that state programs have on which projects they accept. And I can assure you that if the project fits what the governor sees as a vision, his departments tend to be more likely to have the funding go that way. So there's no special funds, but yeah,
so potentially working with the restoration office that's under the NRC would be beneficial.
Well, we're still forming the vehicle for entry, so on restoration economy, there is no formal office for it as such yet. I mean, there's a person working on it, but just plow in that way, plow in through your local development corporations, call our office, you know, catch Hal Harper skiing, you know, we'll do something. But I think it's important in packaging your deals when you're looking for state money to make that part of your pitch, because the governor wants to. He's got his vision about how he thinks this economy ought to evolve, and when we have so much money, we'll kind of twist it to what fits that vision, you know, as long as it's a reasonable twist. Yeah.
I thought I would add to that, is always be prepared to let a politician take the credit after the fact.
Oh, yeah. They all want credit after the fact, yeah.
Yes, sir.
For John, actually, right now in Lewis and Clark County, we're working on planning our Bbrownsfield planning grants and doing assessments. And unfortunately, we have people talking about green space and more parks instead of infill for some commercial. Your technical assistance grant, can that be used for visioning even though we don't have the business identified?
Well, you do not need to have a business identified. But, you know, the old story about using economic development words in the proposal, chances are if you can't make that connection somewhere,
we'd say, well, it sounds like a really nice project, but it doesn't sound like an EDA project. There are, I think, technically 17, something like 17 federal agencies who have signed on to the initiative. And I think, like this morning, there was an example that one of them didn't even know what the Brownfields program is, but persistence pays off. There are a lot of other programs out there, and it might take a little bit more ferreting out to find out just who their Brownfields contact is. But I think that the EPA Brownfield site has all of those agencies on there, and I think they have the coordinator for every one of those agencies listed on their Brownfield site. If I remember, I haven't been on there for a year or two, but that would be a good way to start and be persistent about, well, I see that you're on the EPA site and you're signed on to the initiative and you're one of 17 federal agencies and departments that have agreed to that, and how can you help us do this?
I mean, the idea is to try to stop this movement toward the green parks. Not that that's bad, but trying to have business reference to it. And a lot of times people just can't visualize.
Yeah, and what we do is, it takes everything to make a community. Movie theaters aren't the biggest economic development driver either, but it's the whole thing together, the whole package. And we've seen our business change a lot. We see industrial park plans now with bike paths and green spaces through them. And it makes them a lot more marketable, I can tell you, in this environment. 15 years ago, they'd have hung you up as crazy if you came in with a plan like that. It's changed a lot. And so I think we're a lot more flexible about that kind of stuff. I think the real key is it a good project? Is it an interesting project? Is it a needed project? And I think in the planning phases with the planning grant program, we're much more flexible than we are with a construction project. And that's quite often why we end up doing a planning grant but not involved later in the construction, because it doesn't fit our construction program, because you have to have ABC business there or whatever that's going to result. In the planning phases, you may not know what those companies are. You might be just trying to attract certain types of businesses or companies.
Yeah, just an added thought to that. I've seen a lot of projects now, they become integrated projects. Because a lot of times they might want to build an office park or some other economic things, but there's areas of their property that are in the floodplain. And that's always been a nuisance to them in the past. Now they make it a design feature. It's a restored wetlands with a walking trail, and the people who work in the office park walk there at lunchtime, and the city people can come there, and they integrate it into the community. And that actually adds value to the project, which can translate to dollars and cents in their mind. And that was what can motivate them. I don't care what motivates them, as long as the end result comes out to be desirable. And that's why one of the biggest growing fields right now is landscape architecture. You got young kids can't figure out what they want to do, there's a career field.
I was going to say, the Champion site, you should go and check that out, because one of the big features there, I think, that something that the community's finding too, is the fact that they're connecting the trail system down to the river, and it'll connect all over the California Street Bridge, and that'll be a park area and a beach asset.
I wanted to also respond a little bit to what Evan mentioned about Superfund sites. And it is something to remember that the great thing about the Brownfields program, in my view, as a federal employee, is that it did not add a whole pile of regulations. In fact, as an agency, we don't have to go to EPA and say, is this a certified, brownfield site? Can we do work here and call it a brownfield? We don't have to do that. In fact, there is no such thing. They said this morning they can't give you a list of brownfield sites because that isn't how it works. It's up to us to determine, is this a brownfields? And you saw the definition this morning that they threw up on the screen. Excuse me, but you almost drive a truck through that. Underutilized, suspected environmental issues. There are a lot of projects that can fit that definition. When it comes to Superfund and versus brownfields, I have to tell you that I think a part of that distinction is built in EPA because it's tied to their funding stream. In the case of EDA, we don't have a funding stream through Superfund, nor do we have one through Brownfields. So we don't, if there's a record of decision on a Superfund site, and it has been properly remediated for a purpose that the applicant will bring to us, there's no reason why we can't consider that for a project. In fact, we are right now doing a project in Libby for redevelopment of the former Champion Stimson lumber site. And they stored enormous amounts of asbestos on that site, and I think everybody in Montana is familiar with that story. They are just approaching a record of decision. They have not made the record of decision, but we have had extensive discussions with EPA. And we have already made a grant to them for what we call a design-only public works project, which is we will allow them to, we will cost share with them to develop engineering plans and specifications right down to bid documents. We're not funding the construction in this phase. We're only funding the engineering to get to that reuse as an industrial park. The reason for that is that there's a special provision in our regulations that says we can do design-only projects if there's some complexity to the project that keeps you from going right to construction. And the specific example identified in the regulations is, for example, areas with complex environmental issues. Well, this is just such an area. It is impacted by two Superfund sites, one older one and one that has just been remediated, and they are in the process of doing the record of decision, which they expect to be done. EPA has told us, do this project. We are certain that it will be remediated to the level necessary for an industrial use. And so, while their distinction is primarily a programmatic decision, ours we're not encumbered by that. And so we figure as long as it's remediated, it can be used for that purpose, then we can do it. Now, having said that, I got to tell you, to get from point A to point B on a Superfund site takes a lot more elbow grease than it does with a Brownfields project. Primarily because we as a federal agency don't want to take on any more exposure. We're almost like a private entity at that point. We don't want to take on a lot of exposure for redeveloping a site that has not properly been cleaned. So that requires a lot of discussion and face time with EPA folks to get there. But in this case, they have spent millions and millions of dollars on that site, and EPA has told us that they are confident that we can get to that. We have also done projects in Butte and Anaconda, even though those are two Superfund sites. I guess we just have decided that those two communities aren't going to fall into the earth and go away, so we might as well, they're both economically distressed areas, we might as well do some work there. So we have done some projects. They weren't necessarily, even though they're in within the confines of the defined area of the Superfund, they're not severely impacted anyway. So we did a number of projects there, and
Yeah.
you were there early enough, and Evan thought he had an annual appropriation through EDA, so he was in my front door all the time.
Any other questions or even a comment? Here.
If I may, I just want to, the three folks sitting in the back here from our staff at the Governor's Office of Economic Development, if you haven't met them already, Pat Wise and Chris Augustin and Shannon Hughes. And our level of interest in this is evidenced by their presence here. We think this is a very important thing to go in terms of changing Montana. And my apologies for, I was actually up 7:30 this morning to redo a financial package for a company that I figured would take an hour. It took 3.5 hours. And then I was stuck in traffic out here for another hour, so I missed a lot of the good stuff. But luckily, I've got some talent here that will educate me now a little bit more. But this is really important about the whole ethic of development has changed. And you know, the attitudes people have toward everything from global warming to cleaning up, having a restoration economy in Montana, dealing with global warming, dealing with energy in a clean and green way. You're seeing that the body politic out here is saying that this is an important part of the fabric of developing our society now, that we aren't about just doing bad things and then just disposing it and just trying to hide it away. That has changed in society in a broad way, and that drives public function. So it's an important element for advancing things like brownfields and this type of stuff is to be communicating to elected officials and stimulating thinking among regular folk who will reflect that stuff upward into the decision-making apparatus of our government. Then things happen. That process is underway now. So much more is being done now than 10 years ago and 15 years ago. People are saying things they would never have said then. And they're not saying it because they're political, the leadership is not political risk takers. They're saying it because the folks are saying it. And the investment of your citizens in your communities engage people in what this stuff is about. Because the more they see the value, the more that percolates up, you know, into the decision-making apparatus, and more and better things will happen. So there's a PR function, there's a citizen involvement function that you as leaders in your communities don't forget that part of it. It isn't just about the projects, it's about the attitude.
On that note, thank you all so very much. Thank you to our panelists. We're going to take about a 10-minute break, and then if you could meet us back over at 4:30 at City Council, we'll have a very brief closing session. And then for those of you who would like to tour one of the sites, one of our brownfield sites, one of my babies here in town, you're welcome to do so. There's going to be a bus for transportation.
I do a lot of more kind of reservations on the brownfield projects.
So that's at 4:30 at City Council where we were this morning.
Great.
Thank you all.
Yeah, we got a lot of stress.
I'm looking at Blackfeet, Quarterpack, and Belmont.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, a lot of work with that. In fact, I was all last week at Blackfeet, and we're developing our own codes and regulations.
They're trained to build things, construct good things. And when you go in and you start tearing out stuff and you clump plant something, they just think, well, you don't need to do that. Just, you've got X amount of miles, get it wiped out. And that's the wrong philosophy, in my opinion. I mean, take the time. If you're going to do it right. And I think that's why I've been so successful with working with Becca and Phyllis and Annie is you have to care about what you do and try to do the best you can. And that's one thing I want to touch. If any of you people are, putting people out in the field with equipment, don't turn anybody out there that doesn't know what they're doing. The inspectors I've worked with good to bad, and the good people that have been out in the field and seen the equipment work and know how it works. It just makes all the difference in the world to the contractor. And I've always felt really privileged because from Annie Connor to Becca to Phyllis, we work as a team. It's not contractor, Forest Service, this thing. I mean, it's been a total team effort, and I think that's a lot of the reason we've had the success that we have. I mean, we get into a soupy, sloppy draw, and I can shut the machine down, get out, we stomp around, wait around in the mud, come to a general consensus of what we want to do, and then we go to work doing it. I mean, it's great. I mean, I couldn't be happier. I have the best office of any of you. So, it's just been a pleasure. I love the work. It's treated me well. You know, I'm definitely not getting rich. I don't ever plan on being rich, but I've raised my family and have a nice home, and I'm able to live where I live. You know, that's part of the sacrifice of living in the Clearwater Valley. You don't get rich there. You survive and enjoy, you know, the life that it gives you, and that's all I ask for. And you know, as far as you know, we recreate. 90% of our recreations, of our vacations, are spent on the public land. You know, they always have been, and they probably always will be. Fishing, hunting, you know, whatever. Just going, hanging out for the day. And so, you know, I have a true love for our land. I mean, and it needs to be taken care of. And what we're doing, I'm hoping that, you know, my grandchildren can come to the Lochsaw, and I truly believe it will be better than what I've enjoyed with the work that's going on right now. I mean, they can go up Fishing's Creek and see a salmon spawn. I mean, they can catch a cutthroat out of Lochsaw, and the water's clear, and life's good. I mean,